the hallway lights on the fourth floor of the Meridian Grand Hotel had been dimmed for the evening, which was, in hindsight, exactly the kind of detail Julian Reyes should have paid more attention to. He would remember it later in fragments. The particular cold of the marble under his palm when he braced himself against the wall, the specific wrong shade of flush high on Ethan Cole's cheekbones, a flush that had nothing to do with the 3 glasses of champagne he'd allowed himself all evening, the way the biggest, iciest CEO in Meridian City, a man who once fired a vendor over a 5-minute delay, had looked at him with his pupils blown wide and murmured a name that wasn't the name of the woman currently digging her manicured nails into his sleeve. Julian, Ethan had said, voice wrecked, like something had been dragged out of him against his will. Is that you? And Julian, who had spent 3 months meticulously not falling for his employer, had thought, oh no, he would get to that moment. It deserved to be told properly, with all its humiliating detail intact. But first, he owed the story an explanation for how a mid-level personal assistant with a suspiciously specific knowledge of corporate romance tropes had ended up flattened against a hotel wall by his own boss in the first place. For that, the story needed to rewind 3 months, to the day Julian Reyes woke up in someone else's life. Julian had died the way a depressing number of people die in the modern world, quietly, at his desk, of nothing more dramatic than exhaustion. 3 back-to-back client decks, a blood pressure medication he kept forgetting to take, and a manager who believed sleep was a personality flaw had conspired to stop his heart somewhere around 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. He didn't even get the dignity of a good last thought. 1 second he was proofreading a slide about quarterly synergy, and the next he was standing in a white, humming nothingness, listening to a voice that sounded like a customer service hotline explain his own death to him. Congratulations, the voice had said with the enthusiasm of a vending machine. You have been selected for transmigration service, assignment, assistant, the CEO's reluctant heart, objective, guide the male protagonist, Ethan Cole to his true love, compensation upon completion, $5 million deposited to Ho's original one account. Good luck, Hose. Then the system, whatever it was, had flickered like a dying light bulb and gone dark before Julian could ask a single follow-up question, starting with the extremely important one, which was true love with whom exactly. He woke up gasping in a body that was almost his, save for it being 10 years younger, considerably better dressed, and currently standing in the private elevator of Cole Corporation's headquarters, wearing a nameplate that read Assistant J. Reyes. A glance at his reflection in the elevator's brushed steel doors showed a face he recognized only because it belonged to the side character of a very specific genre of story, the tireless, self-sacrificing assistant novel readers were supposed to root for and then completely forget. He had never actually read the CEO's reluctant heart. He knew it by cultural osmosis alone. The way anyone with a little sister glued to her phone for 3 years running absorbs the tropes of romance fiction whether they want to or not. Cold, brilliant, emotionally constipated CEO. Devoted assistant running his empire and his coffee order with equal precision. A soft, luminous heroine destined to melt the CEO's icy heart by Act 3. Julian had gathered exactly that much before his system had crashed and abandoned him, with nothing but a mission statement and a payout number, $5 million. That was the whole plan. Help Ethan Cole fall in love with his soulmate, watch the credits roll, collect the reward, go home and never work another day he didn't want to. It had sounded almost easy. Julian, lying awake that first night in a body that wasn't quite his, had even allowed himself a moment of smug optimism. He'd read enough workplace advice columns in his old life, sat through enough team-building seminars, survived enough impossible managers, to believe he had exactly the right skill set for the job. Manage a difficult boss, keep the trains running on time, quietly engineer outcomes from 2 steps behind the scenes. He'd done it before, for far less than $5 million and considerably worse company. He had not, at the time, accounted for the possibility that the difficult boss in question might eventually become the whole point. 3 months later, standing on the roof of the Cole Corporation Tower and staring down 18 floors at the traffic crawling along the avenue below, Julian had revised his opinion considerably. Assistant Reyes, where did you go? I haven't seen you in 3 minutes. Julian's phone buzzed against his hip for the 4th time. In as many minutes, Ethan Cole's name blinking up at him like an accusation. He looked at the number, A 3 minutes, the man had timed him, and then back down at the city below, weighing his options with genuine, if slightly theatrical, seriousness. Option 1, jump and gamble on some cosmic reset sending him home early. Option 2, go back downstairs and continue being unpaid emotional labor for a man who apparently could not survive a bathroom break without a status update. He put his phone away, took one last look at the drop, and chose, with great personal sacrifice, to live fine, he thought. We'll do this the smart way. The smart way, as it turned out, involved his contacts list. Over the past 3 months, Julian had developed an encyclopedic understanding of Meridian City's eligible young women, not because he was interested in any of them personally, but because cataloging them was technically his job. He scrolled through the list now. Priya Shah, whose family owned half the shipping lanes on the eastern coast. Bianca Marsh, heiress to a hospitality empire. Renata Okafor, a rising gallery owner with a well-documented crush on Ethan, dating back to a charity auction 18 months prior. He added them all, along with a dozen others he'd been quietly tracking, into a brand new group chat, titled it with an innocuous string of emoji, and typed out a single message. Mr. Cole will be discussing business at the Jinshan Garden restaurant this afternoon. Interested in a chance encounter? DM me for the time and table number. Highest bidder gets the good seat. He hit send, watched the notification count start climbing with immediate and gratifying speed, and slid the phone back into his pocket with the deep satisfaction of a man who has just done an honest day's dishonest work. For the sake of $5 million and an early flight home, he muttered to the elevator doors, straightening his jacket. I will personally set you up, Ethan Cole, whether you like it or not. He wiped the grin off his face somewhere between the 14th and 15th floors, so that by the time he stepped back into the executive suite, he was once again the picture of the perfectly composed personal assistant, of the face he'd spent 3 months perfecting for an audience of exactly one very difficult man. You wanted to see me, sir? Ethan Cole was seated behind his desk large enough to land a small aircraft on, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, his tie loosened by exactly 1 centimeter, the closest thing to disarray Julian had ever witnessed on him. He pushed his gold-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, and through the lenses a pair of very dark, very unreadable eyes settled on Julian with the weight of a held breath. Nothing important, Ethan said, in a tone that suggested it was. In fact, extremely important. Sit. I'll call you if I need something. Julian obeyed, dropping onto the leather sofa across from the desk and grabbing the nearest folder off the coffee table to look occupied. Inside, he was composing a private, extensive list of grievances. This man cannot function without someone in the room. Is he separation anxious? Does he need a nightlight? Is this what I gave up sleeping in on weekends for? Outwardly, he offered only a mild, "Of course, sir," and settled in with the folder balanced on his knee, sneaking his phone out below the edge of it to check on his little matchmaking operation. The group chat had already ballooned to 50 members, every one of them a well-connected young woman from Meridian City's upper crust, all currently locked in a bidding war over the privilege of accidentally running into Ethan Cole over lunch. The number climbed past $20,000 while Julian watched, and he had to physically bite the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing out loud. He failed. A small, involuntary snort escaped him. Assistant Reyes. Ethan's voice, closer than it should have been. Julian hadn't heard him get up. Now the man was standing directly in front of him, tall enough that his shadow swallowed the entire sofa, an eyebrow arched in cool inquiry. You seem very pleased with yourself. Julian's hand shot behind his back with the phone still in it, his smile snapping into place with the panic speed of a man caught red-handed. No, nothing, sir. Just something dumb online. I have a low laugh threshold. Ethan looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that seemed to be searching for something specific and not quite finding it, and then, without warning, sat down. Not across from him. Beside him, one arm stretching lazily along the back of the sofa, in a gesture that managed to be both careless and completely deliberate, the way everything about Ethan Cole was. Julian's brain, still gleefully doing math on those group chat tips, produced a genuinely terrible idea. Sir, he said, scooting a fraction closer and dropping his voice into his best warm, concerned employee register. You know, you're not getting any younger. You work yourself half to death every day. I really do worry about you. Have you thought about finding someone? Someone to look after, mister. Cole for once, instead of the other way around. Ethan turned to look at him properly then, something sharpening behind his eyes. Oh, you have someone in mind? Of course I do. Julian spread his hands, warming to the performance. Look at you. Handsome, powerful, the youngest self-made executive in the entire city. You've got the looks and the bank account. Honestly, even as a straight man, I find you a little tempting. A corner of Ethan's mouth curved upward, a small but unmistakable, the particular smile of a man who has just been flattered exactly the right amount. At least you have taste, he said. I suppose it's not entirely out of the question. He seemed to consider something further, his throat working once around a swallow he didn't quite manage to hide. Fine, arrange it. Arrange A. Julian blinked. Wait, seriously? You mean it? This is a place of business, Ethan said instantly, tone snapping back to its usual glacial register, though the tips of his ears had gone faintly pink. We are still employer and employee. Show some restraint. But there was an expectant gleam in his eyes that undercut the reprimand completely, and Julian, never a man to look a gift horse in the mouth, or in this case, a gift billionaire, barreled forward. Don't worry, it won't interfere with your work at all. How about this? A day-to-day, I'll handle the venue and the schedule, make it romantic, the whole production. Just tell me what kind of woman you like and I'll, a Julian. The full name landed like a dropped glass. Julian's mouth snapped shut. Ethan's expression had gone very still, very cold, in the specific way that made junior associates suddenly remember urgent business 2 floors down. Did you just say, he said slowly, each word bitten off, women, you're offering to set me up. With women. Yes, you said. Forget it. Ethan rose from the sofa in one smooth, furious motion and stalked back to his desk, presenting Julian with a rigid, thoroughly displeased back. I don't need women. Drop it. Classic, Julian thought, catching up to him at a trot, still attempting to negotiate. Cold, moody, unreadable, 100% domineering CEO love interest behavior. Okay, how about just once a week then? Nothing intense, Assistant Reyes. Ethan didn't even look up from the document he'd picked up purely for the prop value. Are you truly this bored at work? Should I transfer you to the Jakarta office for some field experience? The glare that came with it was cold enough that Julian instinctively hunched his shoulders like a scolded dog. He zipped his mouth shut, mimed turning a key, and threw the invisible key over his shoulder for good measure. 3 months into this transmigration, and the useless system had vanished before it could brief him on so much as a single plot point. But 3 years of being press-ganged into watching his little sister's romance dramas had left him fluent in exactly this kind of hero. Cold, sharp-tongued, secretly soft. And Julian was increasingly convinced. The reason for tonight's outburst wasn't that he didn't want a date. It was that he did, badly, and that conflicted violently with the untouchable, unattainable image he'd spent a career constructing. A man like that didn't ask. He deflected, snapped, and hoped somebody else would do the asking for him. Fine by me, Julian thought, watching Ethan's jaw work as he pretended to read a spreadsheet upside down. I've got nothing but time and tricks. For the past month, he'd been running a quiet, extremely lucrative side operation inside that group chat, selling intel on Ethan's schedule to engineer the perfect accidental meetings. A damsel with car trouble outside the parking garage after hours. A heartbroken heiress needing rescue at a gala. A wide-eyed college intern who'd gotten lost and wandered into the wrong private dining room. In 1 month alone, Julian had personally binge-watched over 100 CEO romance dramas, foreign and domestic, purely for research purposes, refining his craft with the dedication of a man who genuinely believed the heavens rewarded hard work. That belief was about to be tested. Not every scheme in Julian's growing playbook made it as far as the group chat. Some of them he ran on instinct, purely because he'd watched enough dramas to know exactly how they were supposed to go. The broken-down car was one of his personal favorites, a classic, reliable, cinematic staple. He picked a rainy Thursday for it, the kind of gray, miserable evening that made a stalled sedan on the side of the road look tragic rather than suspicious. He recruited a junior associate from legal named Priya, who had been not so supply orbiting Ethan's schedule for weeks, coached her through the timing down to the minute, and parked a borrowed car, a hazards blinking mournfully, directly along the route Ethan's driver always took home. All you have to do, Julian told her over the phone, crouched under an umbrella 2 blocks away like a man running a hostage negotiation, is pop the hood, look distressed, and let nature take its course. He can't resist a person in need. It's practically a design flaw. It was, in Julian's professional opinion, a flawless plan. What he had not accounted for was Ethan's driver, a taciturn, unflappable man named Marcus, who had apparently developed his own private rule over the years. Never, under any circumstances, stop the car for a stranded vehicle after dark, no matter how photogenic the distress. He drove straight past Priya's hazard lights without so much as slowing down, while Ethan, a Julian would find out later, never even looked up from the report on his lap. Julian, watching the whole thing unfold from 2 blocks away, with his umbrella slowly collapsing in the wind, felt something in his chest deflate right along with it. Well, he muttered to no one, soaked through and thoroughly humbled, back to the drawing board. He didn't tell Priya it was a wash until he'd walked the 2 blocks back to help her flag down an actual mechanic, mostly out of guilt, and privately filed the entire evening under lessons learned. A chief among them being that Ethan Cole's staff were, infuriatingly, better at their jobs than Julian had budgeted for. The wrong room intern fared marginally better, a nervous, wide-eyed junior hire Julian had talked into accidentally wandering into Ethan's private dining room during a dinner with investors, on the theory that Ethan would be too polite in front of company to send her straight back out. That much, at least, went according to plan. What Julian hadn't anticipated was Ethan's flat, unbothered, wrong room. The elevators are that way, delivered without so much as glancing up from his negotiation, followed immediately by a pointed look in Julian's direction the second the door closed again. A look that said, with perfect clarity, "I know exactly whose idea this was." Julian had smiled, saluted with his coffee cup, and quietly resolved to be more careful in the future. It was somewhere around the 4th or 5th failed scheme that Julian started to suspect, with the dawning horror of a man watching his own carefully laid plans crumble in real time, that Ethan wasn't simply hard to please. He was actively, deliberately uninterested, not shy, not slow to warm up, not secretly waiting for the right woman to come along, but genuinely, thoroughly indifferent to every single opportunity Julian manufactured for him. At the time, Julian had chalked it up to the standard issue emotional constipation of the genre. Cold CEO, guarded heart, needs the right person to crack the shell. It never once occurred to him that the reason none of it was working might have nothing to do with timing, and everything to do with the fact that Julian himself was standing directly in the blast radius of every single scheme, close enough to watch and be watched in turn. Hindsight, as it turned out, was going to be considerably less forgiving than Julian expected. Inside a private dining room at one of Meridian City's more exclusive restaurants, a young woman with flawless contouring and an even more flawless sense of entitlement leaned toward a gilded mirror, tilting her chin at 3 different angles in quick succession. "Julian, tell me honestly," she said, "how does someone as beautiful as me not already have Ethan Cole eating out of my hand?" "Don't lose hope, Miss Lake," Julian said warmly, sipping the latte she'd bought him without a hint of shame. "Things are progressing exactly on schedule, mister. Cole is just a little slow to warm up to people. You've bumped into him 3 separate times now, and he already remembers your name. A little more patience and victory is basically guaranteed. Vivian Lake was the only daughter of one of the oldest, wealthiest families still holding court in Meridian City, accosseted since birth, gorgeous by any objective measure, and afflicted with what Julian privately diagnosed as an incurable case of face blindness to her own considerable ego. She'd fallen for Ethan at first sight during her own 18th birthday gala, and in the month since had spent an amount of money on coincidental run-ins that could have funded a small country's infrastructure. Good bloodline, beautiful face, only heir to a fortune that rivaled Ethan's own. On paper, Julian had decided months ago, Vivian was the strongest candidate for future Mrs. Cole he'd found. A beauty on his arm, wealth beyond even his own, and what man in his right mind would say no to that? He'd run the numbers on every eligible woman in the city, and she came out comfortably on top. Vivian let out a small, satisfied sigh, picked up her phone, and sent Julian a payment with a string of zeros long enough to make his eye twitch with joy. "I'm leaving it in your hands, Julian. Watch him closely for me. Don't let anyone else get an opening." "Leave it to me, Miss Lake," Julian said, lifting his latte in a private toast to his own excellent business sense. After some polite small talk with his generous benefactor, Julian went back to the office and pulled up Ethan's evening itinerary. A gala tonight, 8 o'clock sharp. Time, he decided, to be proactive on Vivian's behalf. A man who took the money and did nothing was hardly a professional. "Sir," he said, strolling into the executive suite with studied casualness, "about tonight's gala, have you picked a companion yet?" Ethan looked up from his monitor, one brow lifting with a curiosity that had a distinctly sharp edge to it. "Oh, I only mean—" Julian pressed on, aware in real time that his footing was getting worse with every word. You usually don't bring anyone, and lately there've been more and more single women trying to strike up conversation with you at these things. I figured maybe it's time to find a steady companion, to fend them off. Just a thought." It was a flimsy excuse, and Julian could hear it getting flimsier the longer he talked. Ethan was famously, almost monastically self-disciplined. It was common knowledge across the company that he attended every function with nothing but his male assistant in tow, and no one questioned it anymore. A sudden pitch for a female companion was, in retrospect, exactly the kind of thing that would set off alarm bells. "Is that so?" Ethan let out a short, cold laugh, as if something had just clicked into place behind his eyes. "I didn't realize Assistant Reyes was quite this observant, noticing every single woman who suddenly turned up around me this past month." The words themselves weren't sharp. The way he said them sent a chill straight down Julian's spine. Oh no, he knows. He knows I've been running an operation behind his back. "Well," Julian said, already backpedaling, "any woman would fall for a man like you, sir. Purely a general observation. Nothing specific." He began edging toward the door with the practiced grace of a man escaping a burning building. "Where do you think you're going?" I wasn't finished. Ethan tapped his chin, apparently thinking it over. "Actually, your suggestion isn't a bad one. A regular companion would cut down on unnecessary complications. Stay. Call the stylist." Julian froze in the doorway. "Wait, a what? You're actually agreeing?" But Ethan had already dropped his head back to his documents, leaving Julian alone with a spinning brain and absolutely no idea what had just happened. He was still turning the conversation over in his head an hour later when a knock sounded at the door, and Ethan's longtime stylist swept in trailing an entourage and a full rack of impeccably tailored suits. "We've got a few options ready for tonight, Mr. Cole," the stylist announced. "Take your pick." Ethan crossed the room, ran 2 fingers along the lapel of a navy tuxedo, and said, almost as an afterthought, "This one for me." Then, without warning, he turned and pointed directly at Julian, still seated on the sofa mid-thought. "And something for Assistant Reyes, too. Different from his usual. I want him sexier tonight, bolder, something appropriate. This is the first time I'm bringing a male companion to an event." Julian's brain went, briefly and completely, offline. Male companion. Since when did I get upgraded from assistant to companion? Is that even in my job description? "Problem?" Ethan asked, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth, evidently in an excellent mood. "Accompanying your employer to a gala is a perfectly normal assistant duty." "That might be true," Julian said carefully. "But sir, you said you needed a female companion. I'm a man. We leave at 8. You have 30 minutes. Ethan was already turning back to his desk, done entertaining the objection. "Take him to the back room. I want someone unrecognizable in half an hour." The stylist, a flamboyant, notoriously inventive man named Reese, whom Ethan paid an eye-watering retainer to keep on permanent call, gave an enthusiastic thumbs up and steered Julian bodily toward the private dressing suite before he could formulate a second protest. 30 minutes later, the door opened on someone Julian barely recognized as himself. The suit was white satin, cut with the kind of precision that felt almost illegal. A deep V at the collar bared a slice of pale collarbone. The waist was cinched narrow enough to circle with 2 hands. From the front, it was the very picture of clean, disciplined elegance, a buttoned-up, restrained. From the back, it was an entirely different argument. A bold triangular cutout ran from the shoulder blades down to the small of his back, the gap laced shut with rows of gleaming white pearls that shifted and caught the light with every step, half concealing, half revealing skin that had never once in his life been on public display. Ethan, waiting in the outer office, scrolling through his phone, looked up when the door opened and simply stopped moving. He stood there, silent gaze tracking slowly over Julian like he was cataloging every detail for later, the collarbone, the cinched waist, the pearls tracing down an exposed back. a something flickering behind his eyes that Julian couldn't name and didn't entirely trust. Then he rose and crossed the room, circling Julian once, slowly, close enough that Julian could feel the heat radiating off him. Julian stood rigid, arms instinctively crossing over his own exposed chest. "Sir, what are you doing?" Ethan didn't answer. He waved Reese and the rest of the styling team out of the room with 2 fingers, and within seconds the 2 of them were alone in a suite that suddenly felt very small. "Not bad," Ethan said finally, reaching out to ruffle Julian's carefully styled hair with one broad palm, undoing 10 minutes of Reese's work in a single motion. "After a little polishing, you clean up like a proper ornament." "Sir, do not call me an ornament," Julian snapped, mortified. If anything, that only improved Ethan's mood. "Your idea this afternoon about finding someone steady," he said, stepping closer, forcing Julian back a pace at a time, until the back of his knees hit the sofa and he sat down hard. "I liked it. Someone reliable to keep the nuisances at bay. And if it happens to be a man," he braced one hand on the sofa's back, leaning down until his breath ghosted warm against Julian's ear. "Even better. 1 bird, 1 stone. You'll be coming with me tonight. That should put an end to the parade of women showing up wherever I go." "You could have led with that," Julian managed, flustered. "I could have found you an actual professional escort. You didn't have to do a. You made this mess," Ethan murmured, close enough that the words landed against Julian's skin more than his ears. "You fix it. And don't think I don't know exactly where all those women this past month came from." Julian's stomach dropped through the floor. He knows. He absolutely knows. By the time he'd recovered enough to formulate a defense, Ethan was already at the door. "What are you sitting there for? The car's waiting." The gala unfolded like a fever dream Julian hadn't consented to. Ethan kept an arm locked around his waist the entire evening, his palm a brand of heat through thin satin, steering Julian through the crowd like something precious and slightly dangerous. At one point, Julian tried to twist free and caught his own nose squarely against Ethan's chest for his trouble, eyes watering from the impact. And in the half-second he spent recovering, Ethan caught his jaw and pressed the softest, most infuriatingly gentle kiss to his mouth. "Sir," Julian hissed the second he could speak, cheeks burning, "I'm not you know I'm not We're putting on a show," Ethan murmured against his ear, voice low as velvet, before Julian could finish the sentence. "People are watching. Play along, and I won't have to kiss you again for real in front of everyone." No one had ever called him by anything but his surname before that night. Ethan's mouth shaped the syllables of his first name like it belonged to him, and something in Julian's chest short-circuited entirely. He spent the rest of the evening playing the doting companion with a paralyzed, plastic smile welded to his face, too rattled to risk what might happen if he didn't behave. By the time the car pulled away from the gala, Julian had exactly one rule left standing between himself and total collapse. "We agreed. No workplace harassment," he said into the back seat, massaging his aching cheeks with both hands. "Airport," Ethan told the driver instead of answering, his voice snapping back into its familiar glacial register. The carefree companion of 5 minutes ago folded neatly away, replaced by the ice-cold executive Julian actually worked for. "Airport?" Julian sat up. "Sir, you said you were taking me home. There's an urgent matter in Ashcombe. The project team's already there. We fly out tonight. You'll be with me for the next few days." "This is inhumane," Julian said flatly. "Assistants are people too. Triple pay for the trip." "Yes, sir." "Your humble and devoted servant lives to serve." Julian folded like a napkin, all principle instantly forgotten. The Ashcombe deal, against all odds, went smoothly. 3 days of negotiations, closed contract, and a celebratory dinner that turned into a drinking contest between Ethan and the partnering company's boisterous, hard-drinking chairman. Glass followed glass, until the chairman finally slid gracefully under the table, and Julian, the last sober adult in the room, was left to see off the remaining guests and then collect his half-conscious employer from the corner booth where he'd been abandoned, staring into the middle distance like his soul had temporarily checked out of his body. "Sir, time to go." No response. Just that unfocused, faraway stare. Seeing no better option, Julian hauled Ethan's arm over his shoulders and dragged him upright, and the 2 of them staggered out through the hallway. Together, Ethan draped bonelessly against him like an oversized, extremely expensive golden retriever. More than once, Julian nearly got smothered against the man's chest en route to the elevator. By the time they reached the hotel room, Julian was out of breath, and Ethan was in no state to produce a key card on his own. "Sir, the card." Ethan simply nosed against his neck, searching for a comfortable spot to rest his head, entirely unhelpful. Left with no choice, Julian dug into his suit pocket one-handed, and his knuckles grazed something distinctly, alarmingly warm on the way to the card. He recoiled so fast he nearly dropped Ethan on the carpet, ears burning red, while a low, strangled sound escaped somewhere above his head. Sorry, sir, Julian babbled, slapping the card against the reader with shaking hands and hauling them both through the door. He got Ethan onto the bed and collapsed beside it, catching his breath, the heat of the other man's body, and the low, familiar note of his cologne pressing in from behind. Then, without warning, arms wrapped around his waist from behind and pulled him backward. "You're awake," Julian said, startled. "I'll get going then, don't." Ethan's grip tightened, his breath warm and alcohol-heavy against Julian's cheek. "Stay, I'm afraid of the dark." A pause. "Also, stop calling me sir. Call me Ethan, sir. I really don't have time for In one smooth motion, Ethan pulled him down onto the bed and caged him there, an arm braced on either side of his head, gaze burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with alcohol and everything to do with something Julian was suddenly, dizzily afraid to name. Julian. His voice had dropped low, rough at the edges. "How can you be this dense? What more do I have to do before you understand how I feel?" Julian's brain simply stopped processing language. What kind of CEO's assistant spends a month playing matchmaker for his own boss? Ethan went on, not waiting for a response, the words tumbling out of him now like something dammed up too long. "I keep you close every single day because I want to see you. I've been about as subtle as a car crash. Why won't you take the hint? If you'd confessed to me, I would have said yes." The words hit like lightning, a searing straight through him, leaving Julian burned from the inside out. "Sir, I think you've had a bit too much to drink," he managed weakly. "You like women, don't you?" If he doesn't like women, some small, panicked corner of his brain supplied, then my entire mission has been aimed at the wrong gender this whole time. In that moment, the only thing Julian could focus on was the sound of $5 million quietly flying out the window into the Ashcombe night. The rest of the evening had the surreal, unmoored quality of a fever dream, enough that by the next morning, Julian had genuinely begun to suspect food poisoning, or possibly that someone had swapped the champagne for something stronger without telling him. But when he woke, Ethan's face across the breakfast table was as cold and unreadable as ever, expression giving away nothing at all, as though the entire previous night had simply never happened, which somehow only made Julian more certain that it had. Back in Meridian City, Julian went straight to Vivian, eager to salvage some momentum on the one front he still understood, but something had shifted. The Vivian who greeted him now wasn't the warm, gushing patron of a month ago. She stood with her arms crossed, gaze sweeping over him with a cool, appraising once-over that made the hair on his neck stand up. "Before anything else," she said, cutting off his opening pitch entirely, "I want you to explain exactly what's going on between you and Ethan Cole. I heard about the last gala." Julian scrambled for footing. "It's a long story. Look, nothing happened. I was just playing a part. President Cole is 100% straight, I promise you. That night, I was just a prop. He used me to block off the other women. Loyal, dedicated, completely committed to his image. Really, when you think about it, it says a lot about his character." Vivian narrowed her eyes, studying him a moment longer, and then, apparently satisfied by the general unlikelihood of the two of them as a couple, gave a small, dismissive scoff. "Makes sense. Why would he ever look twice at you?" A pointed glance at Julian's chest, and a proud little lift of her own. "Fine, about the plan then." Julian agreed to everything with rather more enthusiasm than he felt. The words, "why would he ever look twice at you," sitting strangely, uncomfortably in his stomach the whole drive back to the office, because the truth was, something had changed since Ashcombe, not dramatically but steadily, in 100 small ways. Ethan had started talking to him about things that weren't work, asking his opinion on things that didn't need an assistant's input. It felt, Julian realized with something close to alarm, like they had quietly become friends without either of them ever agreeing to it out loud. And the more he noticed it, the harder it became to remember why interfering in this man's love life for a paycheck had ever seemed like a reasonable plan. Julian had been terrible at this job when he first arrived. a fact he'd spent 3 months quietly, hoping no one would ever bring up. He'd made mistake after mistake, braced every time for the kind of dressing down he'd endured in his old life, the kind of boss who dragged you through the mud for a missed deadline and called it motivation. Ethan never once did that. He simply circled the errors in red pen, slid the document back across the desk, and told him, flatly, without cruelty, to take another look. He kept that same frozen, unreadable expression through all of it. But Julian had started noticing the patience underneath it anyway, the deliberate restraint of a man who could have been cruel and chose, consistently, not to be. So Julian had started staying late, studying every scrap of assistant knowledge he could find. And more often now, when Ethan passed his desk, there was a flicker of something like approval in his eyes, a small, understated, and entirely undeserved by a man who was privately still running a matchmaking scheme behind his back. The guilt of that had started to sit heavier than the $5 million ever had. In the week leading up to the Link Group Gala, Julian did something he hadn't done since arriving in this world. He sat down, alone, with a cup of coffee gone cold beside him, and actually took stock of his own feelings instead of running from them. It wasn't a comfortable exercise. He'd built his entire strategy here on the assumption that he was a background character, an assistant, a plot device, a means to an end with a $5 million price tag attached. Background characters weren't supposed to notice the particular way Ethan Cole's shoulders relaxed by exactly 1 degree when Julian brought him coffee without being asked. They weren't supposed to catalog, without meaning to, the rare, unguarded half-second where Ethan's usual iron composure slipped, a crooked, almost smile over some dry joke, a flash of genuine warmth quickly smoothed back into indifference before anyone else in the room could catch it. Julian had cataloged all of it anyway. Weeks of it, filed away without his permission, the way a person notices things about someone they've stopped being able to see clearly. He thought about Ashcombe, not the parts that still made his ears burn, but the quieter moment just before, when Ethan had said, "I keep you close every day because I want to see you," like it was the most obvious, unremarkable fact in the world, like he'd been saying it for months without words. He thought about the sofa in the office, about being handed folder after folder of mistakes, without a single raised voice, about the particular, deliberate patience of a man who could have made his life miserable and simply chose, over and over, not to. None of that fit the story Julian had been telling himself. Help him find his true love, collect the money, go home. He had built an entire operation, a spreadsheets, group chats, a small underground economy of bribes and favors, around finding Ethan Cole a woman to marry, and it had never once occurred to him, not seriously, not until this exact moment with a cold coffee and an aching chest, that he had spent 3 months auditioning himself for the role instead. He thought about Vivian's voice on the phone at the gala, a bright, proprietary, "I'll take care of him," and the way something ugly and unfamiliar had twisted in his stomach at the sound of it. He had told himself at the time that it was simple professional concern. A good assistant looks out for his employer. That was all. It was not, he now suspected, all. "This is a disaster," he told his empty apartment, out loud, with the particular despair of a man who has just realized he built an elaborate trap and then walked directly into it himself. "I have been actively sabotaging my own love life for 3 straight months. For a woman with a flat compliment and a nice family tree, I am the villain of my own story." The system, wherever it was hiding, offered no comment. It rarely did when it would have actually been useful. He didn't come to any grand resolution that night, no dramatic vow, no sudden clarity. Just a quiet, uncomfortable certainty settling into place under his ribs, the kind that doesn't announce itself so much as simply refuse to leave once it's arrived. By the time he left for the Link Group Gala a few days later, Julian still hadn't decided what, if anything, he was going to do about it. The universe, as it turned out, wasn't going to give him much more time to decide. Time moved quickly after that, and before Julian had fully worked out what to do with his own conflicted feelings, the Link Group Gala arrived exactly as scheduled, the event Vivian had been counting down to for weeks. Julian did what he always did, accompanied Ethan as his assistant, professional and composed. The moment they stepped inside, Ethan waved him off toward the edges of the room. "Go take a break. I've got the rest of the evening handled." Julian retreated to a quiet corner with a mini quiche and watched Ethan work the crowd, a smooth, commanding, effortlessly magnetic, a man who stood out among a sea of soft-bellied executives like something carved from entirely different material. No wonder Vivian fell for him, Julian thought. Not for the first time. If I were a woman, I'd probably fall for him too. The thought unsettled him more than he expected. He grabbed a cocktail off a passing tray and drank it faster than he should have, and then another, until a pleasant warmth settled somewhere behind his ribs and blurred the edges of his self-control. His phone buzzed. Ethan's name on the screen. Julian. Ethan's voice slightly slurred. "Where are you? I've had a bit much. 4th floor. Come get me." Before he could respond, Vivian's voice cut in brightly from somewhere near the phone. "It's fine, Julian. I've got him. Don't worry about it. I'll treat you to dinner sometime, promise." The line went dead. Every instinct Julian had ever developed in this job screamed at him to go home, get in a cab, and let the universe sort itself out. Maybe tomorrow he'd wake up with the mission stamped complete, and this whole complicated mess safely behind him. His legs did not agree with that plan. Logic told him this was just a mission. That he was, functionally, a background character whose entire job was to nudge the plot forward and disappear. But something else entirely, a something that felt disturbingly like a heart he hadn't asked for, told him he couldn't do this to a friend. Couldn't hand someone he cared about over to a woman with an agenda, not when every ounce of him was screaming that something was wrong. He didn't wait for the elevator. He ran. Bursting through the stairwell door on the 4th floor, he found them at the end of the hallway. A Vivian struggling under Ethan's weight, her small frame braced against his much taller one, keycard already swiped, door already open. Miss Lake. Julian strode toward them, blocking the doorway before either of them could pass. "Let me take him from here." "It's fine," Vivian said, impatient, hauling Ethan a step forward. "He won't mind. Move, please. He doesn't like being touched by people he doesn't know well," Julian blurted, grasping for any excuse that might land. Let's slow down. Please. Miss Lake? Please. Give him to me. I'll take care of him. You and I can talk about all of this later." His thoughts were a complete tangle. He knew exactly what he was doing and had absolutely no idea why he was so desperate to do it, only that some visceral, undeniable instinct refused to let this man out of his sight. Their raised voices must have carried, because Ethan, a head lolling against Vivian's shoulder, began to stir, and it was only then, up close, that Julian noticed his flush wasn't the kind that came from champagne. Ethan didn't get red from drinking. He never had. This was something else. Someone had drugged him. Something cold and furious surged up through Julian's chest, obliterating every ounce of professional restraint he'd been clinging to. He crossed the last few feet in 2 strides, pulled Ethan bodily out of Vivian's grip, and hauled him into his own arms. Vivian stumbled, catching herself against the wall, then grabbed for Ethan's wrist to pull him back. "Julian Reyes," she snapped, eyes blazing. "I'm warning you, don't interfere. Ethan needs me right now. What exactly are you planning to do, taking him away like this? Find him some other woman? Or are you just a shameless little snake trying to climb into his bed yourself?" "Excuse me," Julian started, too furious to form a proper sentence. Ethan chose that exact moment to stir fully awake against him, breath ragged and uneven, and with startling force he shoved Vivian's hand off his wrist and pulled Julian in against his chest instead, both hands framing his face. "Julian." His voice was wrecked, hoarse, barely holding together. "Is it you?" Julian's heart stuttered to a complete stop and then restarted at double speed. "Yes, it's me. I'm calling a doctor right now, But the moment Ethan registered, really registered, that it was Julian standing in front of him, he shoved Vivian away entirely and half-carried, half-dragged Julian into the hotel room instead, using the last thread of his own rationality to lock the door behind them before the drug finished pulling him under completely. What followed, Julian would later think, was less a night than a controlled fall, a heat and breathless want, and the particular kind of desperation that comes from a man fighting his own body and losing. Ethan's hands were feverish, his voice cracked and pleading between kisses, and Julian, dizzy on cocktails and adrenaline, and something that had been building quietly in his chest for weeks without his permission, found he didn't actually want to stop him nearly as much as he should have. "Julian," Ethan breathed against his skin, fingers shaking despite the strength behind them. "It hurts. Will you, help me? I won't hurt you. Trust me, please. Ethan, wait, we should slow down. Let me call someone, He didn't manage to finish the sentence. Ethan kept his promise in the end. He didn't hurt him, but he opened a door that night that Julian had spent 3 careful months pretending didn't exist, and by the time exhaustion finally pulled them both under, there was no pretending left to do. Julian woke first, to a wrecked bed and the low, even sound of Ethan still deeply asleep beside him, and did the only thing his panicking brain could think to do. He grabbed his things and fled the room like the building was on fire. "Get out here, you human trafficking excuse for a system," he hissed at the empty air of his own apartment 3 hours later, standing under a shower turned up scalding hot. "And explain to me right now what you've done to my life." The system, predictably, said nothing at all. Julian didn't leave his apartment for 3 days. No matter how hard he tried to think about anything else, the memory of that night kept surfacing, unbidden, relentless, replaying itself in 100 different, increasingly mortifying variations. He imagined 100 ways forward and discarded every single one. He seriously considered abandoning the mission entirely, staying in this world, finding an ordinary job, becoming a nameless office drone somewhere far away from Coal Corporation and everything it represented. Anything but going back to face Ethan. He didn't even let himself wonder whether Ethan would do what he'd done after Ashcombe, a wake up, wipe his expression clean, and act like nothing had happened at all. But if that was really how it would go, then what, exactly, had that night even been? The question circled endlessly, and by the 3rd day, Julian's head was spinning too hard to keep avoiding it. He finally powered his work phone back on, and it lit up instantly with a flood of missed calls and messages, one line jumping out from the top of the screen before he could brace himself for it. "Mr. Cole has been in a car accident. Critical condition. Please contact his parents immediately." Every ounce of confusion and shame evaporated on the spot. Julian didn't remember the drive to the hospital, only the doorknob under his shaking hand and the room beyond it. And then, before he'd fully processed that he was even inside, familiar arms pulling him into an etchingly tight embrace from behind. "Julian, I'm sorry." Ethan's voice, rough with something that sounded suspiciously like held-back tears. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have lied to you. I know you must be furious with me. But please, don't push me away yet. Let me finish. Just, let me say this." Julian went still, heart hammering, and let him. "It's the first time I've ever liked someone," Ethan said, arms tightening around his waist, chest pressed hard against his back like he was afraid Julian might vanish the second he let go. "And that someone is a man. Wait, no, that's not. I don't mean it like that. I've never been confused about liking men. I know exactly what I like. I like you. That night, I acted on impulse, and when I woke up, you were already gone. I wanted to apologize, to ask if you'd give me a real chance, but you wouldn't see me, so I lied about the accident. I'm sorry, I had to see you." Julian stood frozen in his arms, and in the sudden silence understood, all at once and with total clarity, exactly what his own heart had been trying to tell him for weeks. To hell with the mission. To hell with the $5 million. All he wanted, standing in that hospital room, was to hold this ridiculous, difficult, secretly gentle man and never let go. He didn't say any of that out loud. He just stood there, quiet, working through it. And Ethan, mistaking the silence for rejection, went rigid against him. A moment later, Julian felt something warm and unmistakably wet against the back of his neck. Ethan was crying. "Ethan." Julian said his name gently, the real one, no title attached. "If you don't let go soon, you're going to suffocate me." Now that he finally understood his own feelings, he wasn't about to let the moment slip past him a second time. He turned in the circle of Ethan's arms, spun them both around, and pinned his very tall, very stunned employer against the wall instead, rising up on his toes to kiss him properly, every unsaid word of the last 3 months folded into it. When they finally broke apart, breath-tangled, Julian grabbed a fistful of Ethan's collar and growled, only half joking, "You owe me $5 million. Do you have any idea what I gave up for you?" Ethan blinked and then smiled, a slow, stunned, entirely undone, against his mouth. "Anything," he said. "Whatever you want. Me, the company, all of it. It's yours." After that, Julian had absolutely no intention of ever leaving this world behind, and no intention whatsoever of letting anyone else so much as look twice at Ethan Cole again. Which was why, on a completely unremarkable afternoon months later, the long-lost system chose that exact moment to reappear, a flashing back into existence in a burst of light, and an enormous, garish interface hovering in midair. "Congratulations, hose," it announced with all the smugness of a machine that had contributed nothing at all. Mission complete. $5 million reward has been deposed to your original account. It went on bragging for a solid 10 minutes about its own excellent judgment, about how flawlessly Julian had completed the mission entirely without its help. Julian, once he'd recovered from the shock, bombarded it with 3 months' worth of furious questions and finally got the truth out of it. He had, in fact, transmigrated into a BL novel from the start. Ethan had always been the male lead. Julian himself had been the male lead's actual love interest all along. The entire mission from day one had simply been to get the two of them together by whatever means necessary. Julian spent a full minute wanting to strangle the system with his bare hands. It only whined back that its core had crashed the instant the mission was issued, and if a passing maintenance inspector hadn't happened by, it might never have rebooted at all. Fine. Not entirely its fault, apparently. Still, if he'd known from day one, Julian privately thought, he would have skipped the entire elaborate matchmaking scheme and gone straight for Ethan months earlier. The mission's completion was, admittedly, a pleasant surprise, but Julian found he had no interest at all in going home yet. The system assured him this world ran on its own separate timeline, he could live out a full, ordinary lifetime here, and only return to his original world once he'd passed away peacefully, old and unhurried, whenever that day eventually came. So he and Ethan built exactly that kind of life together. It didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't, in the beginning, especially graceful. Julian kept his job for another year out of sheer stubbornness, insisting he'd earned the title of assistant fair and square and wasn't about to give it up just because the org chart had gotten complicated. Ethan, for his part, discovered he had an entire personality's worth of ridiculous, doting habits he'd apparently been saving up for exactly this occasion. A showing up to Julian's desk with coffee made precisely the way he liked it, clearing entire afternoons off his own calendar for no better reason than wanting Julian in the room, texting him from 2 floors away instead of just walking down the hall, as if the extra 90 seconds of anticipation were worth something. Vivian, to everyone's mild surprise, took the whole thing better than expected. She showed up at Julian's apartment 3 weeks after the hospital, arms crossed, chin lifted, and announced that she'd decided, generously, to forgive him for stealing her future husband, on the sole condition that he introduce her to literally anyone else in Ethan's social circle with a comparable net worth. Julian, delighted to be let off so lightly, spent the better part of a year running an entirely new matchmaking operation on her behalf, this time with his whole heart in it and considerably better results. She married a shipping heir 18 months later and sent Julian, unprompted, an obscene number of wedding favors as thanks. Years later, when the country finally passed marriage equality into law, Ethan spent an embarrassing amount of money making, absolutely certain the two of them became the first legally married same-sex couple in the nation, the day the ink dried, chartering an entire rooftop venue, flying in a string quartet, informing exactly nobody how much any of it cost, and standing at the altar looking, for possibly the first time in his adult life, completely unguarded in front of a room full of people. Julian cried through the entire ceremony and pretended unconvincingly that it was the wind. Their story ran on for decades after that. Through the slow, unremarkable accumulation of an ordinary life neither of them had ever expected to get to have. Gray hair arriving first at Ethan's temples and then, more stubbornly, at Julian's. A dog neither of them had wanted and both of them adored. Arguments over nothing that dissolved within the hour. A running joke, revived every anniversary without fail, about the exact dollar amount Ethan still technically owed him. Every small, unglamorous proof of a love that had simply never run out, year after year, until one ordinary morning, Julian woke up and couldn't wake Ethan beside him. He did exactly what he had always privately imagined he would, put their affairs in order, gave away what was left of their fortune, and lay down quietly in his husband's arms one last time before calling for the system and letting go of this world for good. When he opened his eyes again, he was back in his own, original life, of the $5 million sitting untouched in an account he barely recognized as his own, and a strange, hollow quiet where a full lifetime's worth of love used to be. He tried for a while to live like a man with nothing left to do. He slept until noon. He let his phone die and didn't bother charging it for days at a time. He sat in coffee shops nursing drinks he didn't finish, watching other people's ordinary lives move around him, A couple arguing gently over a shared dessert, a father wrestling a toddler into a coat, an old man reading the same newspaper page for 20 minutes without turning it, and felt, every time, the specific hollow ache of a man who had already lived a full life, and somehow ended up back at the beginning of an emptier one. $5 million sat untouched in an account he could barely bring himself to look at. It had once been the entire point. Now it felt like a receipt for something he'd already spent, for someone he'd already gotten to keep. He drifted like that for the better part of a year, going through motions, filling days, waiting without quite admitting to himself that he was waiting for anything at all. Until one evening, scrolling through an unremarkable video online, he stopped on a very, very familiar face. Rising business star Ethan Cole, the caption read. He watched the whole clip twice, then a third time, studying the tired, guarded set of those shoulders on screen. A man who hadn't met him yet, who didn't know yet that he liked being teased, or that he talked to himself when he thought no one could hear, or that somewhere underneath all that armor was a person who cried at his own wedding and called it the wind. Julian felt something in his chest wake up for the first time in a year, sudden and absurd and entirely without his permission, and found himself laughing out loud, alone, at nothing at all. By the following Monday, he'd sent in his rasama, and just like that, somewhere across the city, Cole Corporation quietly gained a new personal assistant. A story that had already ended once began all over again, exactly the way it was always going to, and if the universe has anything to say about it, which, this time, it very much does, not really the end at all.